I'm here with Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Alexander, you said in one of our live streams that the Russians will definitely be very active behind the scenes and using their diplomatic prowess and their ability to coordinate and negotiate on the diplomatic level with various parties to try to de-escalate what has happened in Iraq and what has happened with the murder of Soleimani. And today we do have the first indications that the Russians are working to try and figure a way, an off-ramp off of this very tense situation. Putin was meeting with Assad. So, Alexander, take us into how you see things unfolding with Russian diplomacy being used to once again provide some sort of off-ramp to what is happening in Iraq and Iran, because no one wants war, and that includes the Russians.
Well, the Russians absolutely do not want war in the Middle East. And I really want to make that point very, very clear. I know that there are some people who insist that the Russians are somehow allies of Iran and that they're pushing the Iranians forward in some way, and that they have some grand agenda to expel the US from the Middle East and to establish themselves as the dominant power in the Middle East. Nothing could be further from the truth. What the Russians always look for in these situations is stability, because they are extremely risk averse and they do not want war and chaos that could destabilize the soft underbelly, if you like, of what was formerly the Soviet Union in Central Asia, and which might reignite that terrible jihadi war that they had to fight in the Northern Caucasus, which took up so much of their time and energy, and where eventually they prevailed. So we've seen the Russian diplomacy, as you correctly say, move into overdrive. So within hours of Soleimani's killing, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov was talking to the Turkish Foreign Minister Cavusoglu. Then a few hours later, the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu was on the phone to the chief of Turkish military intelligence. And then he also talked to the chief of the Iranian militaries, the chief of the Iranian General Staff. So that's the head of the Russian military talking in effect to the militaries of Turkey and Iran. And, the chief himself, Vladimir Putin, he's now flown to Damascus, where he's met with Bashar al-Assad and has had detailed meetings with Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria, who the Russians rescued when the situation in Syria was in absolute crisis back in 2015, and with ISIS at the gates of Damascus. And it was the Russian military intervention that pushed them back and stabilized the situation there. So he's talking to Assad. Assad, of course, is somebody who knows the Middle East extremely well. He is the leader of a key country in the area. And directly after his long discussions with Assad, Putin flew to Turkey, firstly to Istanbul, and then he's going to meet Erdogan, President Erdogan of Turkey, and they're going to be discussing, firstly, the opening of the Turk Stream pipeline, but also he's going to be discussing the Iraq situation, Soleimani, and of course, he's also going to be discussing Turkish policy towards Libya. And then directly after he meets Erdogan, Putin returns to Moscow, where on the 11th of this month, he will be hosting the leader of Germany, Angela Merkel, who's also got concerns about the situation in the Middle East, but he's also the US's most important ally in Europe. So you can get a sense of the pace of Russian activity. It's not something you get much discussed in the international media, but the Russians are there all the time. They're talking to everybody. Putin, by the way, also had a telephone conversation a couple of days ago with Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. And of course, on top of all of these visible things that we know about, we can be sure that there will be private, undisclosed conversations going on between the Russians and the Iraqis, and the Russians and the Iranians also. So there will be contacts going on all the time at all levels, and the Russians, to the extent that they can, will also be talking to the US. So the Russians are very active and very busy at the moment. And they are, as you rightly say, people who take diplomacy extremely seriously and are very good at it.
How can the Russians provide an off-ramp for Donald Trump to get out of this mess?
Yes.
Because in my mind, I cannot figure out a way for Donald Trump to get out of this. I think, and it's my opinion, I think he's been boxed in.
Yes.
He's lost all his leverage on the Democrats, on Pelosi, on the impeachment trials, with the neocons, with the Grahams, with the Boltons, with the War Party, with the Hawks, in the Senate, with Israel. I think all these parties have a lot to gain out of a war with Iran.
Yes.
And Trump has everything to lose. And they don't care if Trump is reelected or not. As a matter of fact, I think all these people I just mentioned would be more than happy to see Trump lose. So for them, he's disposable as long as they get their war with Iran. How can Russia, and it doesn't have to be announced because we know the mainstream media will flip out, Trump talked to Putin or whatever, but in a very secretive, very low-key way, how can Russia constructively provide an off-ramp?
Right. The first thing they're going to do, and I think this is going to be their priority at the moment, is to try to restrain the Iranians from any kind of extreme reaction. Because as we discussed in a recent video, what the neocons want is a war between the United States and Iran. The neocons want that. Netanyahu and the hardliners in Israel want that. And there's some hardliners in Saudi Arabia who want that too. So if the Iranians do something, extreme, they will be playing into the hands of the hardliners in all of those countries, in a situation where Trump's ability to control the situation in the United States has become very fragile. So the Russians will be saying to the Iranians, look, we support you. We will continue to provide you with economic help. We will provide you with a certain amount of military help, because we have just provided Iran a short while ago with S-300 air defense missiles. We'll provide you with intelligence, with all kinds of things. But we do not want you doing something that is going to provoke the United States and is going to put Donald Trump in a position where he can't pull back. So the Russians will be saying those things to the Iranians. And by the way, I think they will get a receptive, they'll get a receptive ear from people in Iran. I think people underestimate how sophisticated the Iranian political leadership is. Yes, there are hardliners in Iran. Yes, there are very angry people within the military and the security services in Iran. And of course, we've seen the angry crowds in Iran itself. But the leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei, who, by the way, is believed to have studied in Russia and to speak Russian, he is a sophisticated man and a worldly man. And so is Hassan Rouhani, who is the president of Iran. So is Zarif, who is the foreign minister. So is Larijani, who is the head of the Iranian parliament. And so, of course, are the various commanders of the Iranian army and the Revolutionary Guards. So the Russians will be talking to all of those people. They will be saying, look, we understand that you will have to respond in some form and in some way, but try to do it diplomatically. You're taking steps with the JCPOA. You're moving away from it. Don't go too far on that. Don't isolate yourself from the Europeans entirely. And if you're going to respond militarily against the United States, try to avoid killing Americans, because that can't help you in the end. So that's what they will be saying to Iran. They will be saying that to help the Iranians. They will be saying that to help Donald Trump and to avoid a war. And they will be saying also to the US, and let's be very clear, it's very difficult for the Russians to talk directly to Donald Trump, and any attempt to talk to Pompeo is almost hopeless. I mean, Pompeo is the arch hardliner here, so they will have difficulty talking to the US, to Trump and Pompeo, but they do have well-established channels with the US military. They talk to the US military regularly in Syria. There is a communications line, a deconfliction line active in Syria. And of course, there is a direct link between the chief of the general staff in Russia, who's General Gerasimov, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. So they will be passing on their information, their ideas through these channels directly to the Pentagon, which is where they will be trying to do their diplomacy. And of course, the other people they will be talking to are America's allies, people like Netanyahu, people like Merkel, whom, as I said, Putin is due to meet in a few days. So what they will be trying to say to the Americans now is, look, we're leaning on the Iranians not to escalate the situation further. You must also now respond. The situation is very difficult. Iraq is also in a very difficult situation. Try to de-escalate. Don't send troops into Iraq. Start gradually taking them out, because that is the only thing you can realistically do. So I think that's what the Russians will be trying to do. They will be trying to hold the line to prevent the situation bursting into an out-and-out conflict over the next few weeks. Their focus will be to try to keep things calm over the next few weeks, so that further down the line, we can start moving back towards more serious negotiations. But, you know, a lot of damage has been done. I think personally, the JCPOA is dead, and I don't think anything the Russians can now do is going to revive it.
Okay, staying on the JCPOA and Europe, you mentioned Merkel.
Yeah.
And my thinking is this, Alexander, that this could be an opportunity for someone in Europe to step up and become that leader, especially when dealing with foreign policy issues and crises like we're seeing right now. It's not going to be Merkel. I think we know that, even though Putin's going to meet with her.
Yes.
Who could step up in Europe and provide some sort of leadership, especially now that JCPOA is all but finished, and also help the diplomatic effort to de-escalate the situation? And I was, on a side note, I was listening to George Galloway, his radio show, and someone asked him, what would you do if you were prime minister in the UK? Because Boris Johnson hasn't really said much. And Galloway said something interesting. He said, I would be on a plane to Tehran, and I would start de-escalating this. And to me, it's stuck with me, because back in the day, the UK would have taken that leadership role, and they would have said, I'm on a plane to wherever I need to be in order to provide that diplomatic help to de-escalate the situation. Today, and it's not a knock against Boris Johnson at all, but I'm just thinking to myself, what countries, what person in Europe could actually provide that sort of wisdom and restraint and leadership that's needed outside of Putin? Because Putin definitely needs all the help he can get.
Yes, I have to say straight away, first of all, and you know, talking as someone who's British, it has been one of the great pains for me to see how Britain has become completely marginal in all this, or in all international diplomacy. Britain isn't involved in diplomacy anymore. It's been completely frozen out of all of the discussions on Ukraine, for example. I mean, there's no British input in that. It's not involved in any of the discussions about resolving the conflict in Syria. And of course, it's not involved in any of the discussions relating to the conflict between the US and Iran. The British have no word or say in any of this anymore. 30 years ago, it was different. The British were there. And the British, of course, had this tremendous diplomatic tradition and this tremendous diplomatic clout. They don't have it anymore. And it's very sad for me to see that. Now, Merkel, until fairly recently, did. The reason that Putin has summoned her to Moscow, and notice she is going to see him, he is not going to see her, and that is important. The reason she's going to see him in Moscow is not just to discuss the Middle East. She's also got to discuss Ukraine, and she's also got to discuss the issues around Nord Stream 2. But the person who's tried in Europe in some muddled and incoherent way to step up to the plate on this issue is Macron. And he's not found the courage to go to Tehran, and he won't find the courage to do that. But he did at least telephone the Prime Minister of Iraq and say to him directly after the killing of Soleimani that France supports Iraqi national sovereignty. Now, the point about that call is that, of course, the killing of Soleimani was an extraordinary, flagrant breach of Iraqi national sovereignty. So by making that call, Macron, in effect, was signaling his disagreement with what happened. But it's so veiled, it's so weak, it's so pathetic, frankly, that, I mean, you can't really look at Macron to exercise any kind of leadership. There is no leadership coming out of Europe. There hasn't been for a very long time now. I mean, the last time the Europeans took a strong line on anything was during the 2003 invasion of Iraq, when Chirac and Schroeder, the French president and the German chancellor, opposed it. There's been nothing like that since then.
Yeah, I remember that. And the U.S. was very upset, upset.
Yeah.
And they were proven right.
They were proven right.
Were proven right.
Absolutely. They were entirely proven right. And it was a major diplomatic action, and it had consequences. Now, the Europeans, to be very clear, are horrified with the Soleimani killing. I mean, they backed the JCPOA. They did absolutely nothing to support it. Their attempts to maintain a good dialogue with Iran went nowhere, because they were never prepared in the end to defy the United States. I predicted that they wouldn't. I wrote an article for the Duran right at the time when the US pulled out of the JCPOA, in which I predicted that the Europeans would be a broken reed in this. And they were, and they have been, and now they're paying the price. They're seeing the situation in the Middle East escalate out of control, and frankly, a feeble telephone call from Macron is not going to change that. Compare what Macron is doing, one telephone call, to what Putin is up to. I mean, traveling to Damascus, traveling to Istanbul to meet Erdogan, all the frenetic diplomacy that the Russians are engaged in.
Do you see anyone, Alexander, anywhere in the world outside of Europe now that can provide some sort of help to get an off-ramp out of this this situation? Yes. Anyone? China?
Yes, China is. The Chinese aren't there.
Anyone else in Asia, in the Middle East region? Does any name come to mind that could work alongside Putin and somehow get some de-escalation here?
I mean, to be absolutely clear, the Chinese are involved. I mean, again, they're always very careful to stay under the radar, but they're becoming increasingly important as a major trade partner for both Iran and Iraq. I believe I'm right in saying that China is now actually Iraq's major trading partner. So, I mean, you know, the Chinese are there, and they will be giving Putin and the Russians all the backing that they can. And other countries are also, I mean, India, which is an important country, is also undoubtedly wanting a peaceful resolution to all of this. So many countries are involved, but it's the Russians who are doing all the heavy lifting, because realistically, who else is there?
Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much, guys. If you like this video, click on that subscribe button, click on that notifications bell. Check us out on Telegram, download the app, subscribe there, PayPal, Patreon, Subscribe Star. Please donate to us as well. That really helps us out a lot. Duran Video, BitChute, Soundcloud for an audio copy of this video. You know the drill, everybody. Help us out on all of those networks, platforms, channels. All the links are in the description box down below. But Alexander, a more important issue is how we can help out and how the whole community can help out with the fires in Australia.
Yeah.
And as you will explain, doing a video on that is a little bit out of our depth.
Yes.
Discussing issues like that for a geopolitical and political channel is something that I don't think we'd be very good at. But we did come up with a way that we can definitely help, and actually maybe an even more important way than a video, and that is by giving, well, you say it, Alexander, to the NSW Rural Fire Service and Brigades Donations Fund. It's a long word, but it helps out.
Indeed. These are the firefighters in Australia who are combating these terrible fires. Can I just say, what Alex says is absolutely right. I mean, we are a geopolitics channel. We can do geopolitics, we can do foreign policy, we can discuss the politics in the US, we can talk about legal issues, we can talk about economics. We are not scientists. We're not climate scientists. That isn't something we really are able to talk about in any informed way. If we try to talk about it, we would simply be rehashing all the things other people are saying. And what would be the point of that? And as we're not climate scientists and we're not firefighters either, the only way we feel that we can really contribute to this story, and it is a huge story, these fires are on an enormous scale, is by showing our support for the people who are fighting these fires, by, as Alex said, supporting them through this fund that exists to help them. I should say I'm not obviously a firefighter, but I have had dealings with the British Fire Service in the past. I was once on very friendly terms with a member of the British Fire Service, and I remember finding out from him what an incredibly dangerous and difficult job that is. And of course, what is going on in Australia is on a huge scale. And bear in mind, these people who are fighting those fires are having to do so all the time. It is incredibly dangerous work. It is extraordinarily exhausting work. So they need all the support that they can. So that's how we're going to support them. That's how our community is going to support them. How are we going to do it? We're going to give to them all the proceeds from the sales of our ebooks, which you can find in our shop. We have 4 ebooks. We have one on Russiagate. We have one on Brexit. And we've got 2 new books, one on Ukrainegate and one on the Epstein scandal. And we're from now on going to commit all the proceeds that we make from the sales of those books, all 4 of those books, to that fund to support those firefighters. And if I can just say a few things about those 2 books, these 2 new books, Ukrainegate and Epstein, they don't seem to be very similar. In our opinion, they are very similar. They're both huge scandals in the United States. The difference between them is that whilst Ukrainegate is a scandal which has attracted a vast amount of attention, huge amount of talk about it on the media, in discussion programs, on cable news, on terrestrial news, in the column inches of the New York Times, the Washington Post, and all those other newspapers. In the end, when you drill down, it is a scandal about exactly nothing. No crime is alleged. There are no witnesses. Nobody has come forward and said that they saw or heard Donald Trump doing any bad thing. It is literally a scandal about nothing at all. And yet it is getting all that attention. Contrast that with Epstein, the Epstein scandal, any number of terrible crimes committed there, real victims, crimes committed over many years, all carried out in full light of day. And how much attention is it getting? Only a tiny fraction of the attention that Ukrainegate gets. And it's only every so often when something unusual happens, like Prince Andrew gives an idiot interview to Newsnight, or there's been some photos that have just appeared of Epstein's cell where he died in such obscure circumstances. It's only then that you get some little things cropping up in the news. So why the silence about the real scandal, the Epstein scandal, and the vast publicity around Ukrainegate? Well, I would argue it's because the same people are involved in both, but they are pursuing their anti-Trump agenda in the one, and they've got lots to hide in the other. And we have tried in those two books, for which I should say I have written prefaces, to try to bring out what those two scandals are really about. So you want to understand those scandals, you can buy them from our shop. And as I said, as Alex has said, all the money that we make from those books, from now on, it goes to support those firefighters. And of course, you don't just find books in our shop, you find other amazing things. You find magic mugs like this one, which is at the moment got my English breakfast tea in it. I drink tea all the time, as everybody knows. This is my first, well, I had two mugs, which were my first ones. This is one of them with a double-headed eagle of the city of Moscow and St. George. And I've had it now for, a year. And you can see that he's in absolutely perfect condition, despite, relentlessly heavy use. It's light and it's strong, and there's no chips, no cracks. The double-headed eagle, the coat of arms of Moscow, it looks perfect. It looks as new. It keeps your tea warm, keeps your coffee warm, or hot, I should say, keeps your beer cold, and it survives any amount of hard use, as I can testify. They're the best mugs I know, and you can find them in our shop. And you will also find other tremendous things, like amazing 100% cotton shirts, like the t-shirt I'm wearing and the t-shirt Alex is wearing, this one with a double-headed eagle. You can see it there. Alex has got Free Assange on it. I mean, we are great believers and supporters of Julian Assange. And you will also find long sleeve t-shirts like the one I was wearing when I was having my New Year holiday. My wife goes skiing in the Alps. I don't ski myself. My eyesight isn't good enough for it. But I was walking the dogs on the cold, icy slopes in my trusty, long-sleeved Duran t-shirt, and that kept me very warm and extremely comfortable. And you can also get our polo shirts which look great when you do après ski, as I discovered, but you can also find them, you can use them for all kinds of other occasions. They look incredibly smart. So you can find our shirts, you can find hoodies, you can find hats, you can find stickers, all great things in our shop. And they're all there for you, as are our books, which, as we would repeat, are there to help the firefighters now. So come to our shop, be the proud owner of all those things, help the Duran, help the firefighters in Australia. Alex will tell you how to do it.
I'll put links in the description box, as well as I'll pin links as the first comment as well in the comment section, which will direct you to those ebooks. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you very much. Until next time, everybody, take care.